Everyone knows the story. Moses is in the desert, sees a burning bush that doesn't burn up, and a voice speaks to him. When Moses asks who is speaking, the answer comes clearly: I am that I am. Simple as that. 3,000 years of history, 3 great religions, billions of believers, all based on that answer. But Baruch Spinoza discovered something that changed everything. In 1670, Spinoza was studying the original biblical texts in Hebrew. Not the translations that came down to us, but the exact words that were written millennia ago. And when he reached that famous passage in Exodus, he stopped. The words that were there, in the original Hebrew, didn't say, I am that I am. They said something completely different. Spinoza read and reread. He checked with other ancient texts. He consulted Hebrew grammars, and he came to a terrifying conclusion. For 3,000 years, humanity had believed in a wrong translation. The name that God really revealed to Moses had nothing to do with I am that I am. It was something much simpler, more direct, and infinitely more revolutionary. When Spinoza tried to share this discovery, the reaction was immediate and brutal. He was excommunicated by the Jewish community with a curse that had never been used before: that his name be erased forever, that no one ever speak to him, that even his memory be considered cursed. Why? Because what he discovered wasn't just a translation error. It was something that could destroy the foundations of 3 entire religions. The truth that Spinoza found remained buried for 350 years. Few dared to revisit his discovery. Even fewer had the courage to spread it. But today that changes, because what God really said to Moses that morning in the desert is something everyone deserves to know. Something that will make you question everything you've learned about religion, about God, about the very nature of reality. The greatest revelation in human history is about to be told, and it begins now. It was winter 1670 when Baruch Spinoza made the decision that would change not only his life, but potentially all human understanding of God. Sitting in his modest house, surrounded by the books that were his only true companions, he opened for the first time a Hebrew Bible with a different purpose. He no longer wanted to believe. He wanted to understand. Spinoza had been born into a respected Jewish family, educated in ancestral traditions, versed in sacred texts since childhood, but something had always bothered him. The translations he read in Latin, in Portuguese, in Dutch, they all seemed to carry a certain artificiality, as if the original words had been polished, domesticated, transformed into something more palatable for the masses. What if the translators had done more than translate? What if they had interpreted, edited, hidden? These questions had tormented him for years. Finally, he decided to investigate on his own. He began with the book of Exodus, with the most famous passage of all, the encounter between Moses and God at the burning bush. Everyone knew the story. Moses, fleeing Egypt after killing an overseer who was beating a Hebrew slave, was wandering in the desert of Midian when he saw something impossible, a bush on fire that was not consumed. He approached, and a voice spoke to him, identifying itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when Moses asked for the divine name, after all, how would he convince the Israelites that he had really spoken with God? The answer everyone knew was, I am that I am. Spinoza opened the Hebrew text to the passage in Exodus 3:14. His eyes scanned the ancient words, the letters that had survived millennia of persecution, destruction, reconstruction. And then he stopped. The words were not, I am that I am. In Hebrew, it was written, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. At first glance, it might seem to mean the same thing. But Spinoza knew Hebrew better than most rabbis of his time. He knew that the verb ehyeh was not simply am. It was a specific form of the verb to be, the first person singular of the imperfect, which indicates a continuous, unfinished action in process, not I am, but I will be, or better still, I am being. A present action, but in movement, in constant transformation. But there was more. The particle asher didn't mean that in the sense of identity. It meant that in the sense of cause, of process, of the one who makes it so that. Spinoza felt his heart racing. The words he was reading didn't form a philosophical declaration about the eternal and immutable nature of God. They formed something completely different. Ehyeh asher. Ehyeh didn't mean, I am that I am. It meant, I will be the one who will make to be. Or, in a more precise translation, I will become the one who causes things to become. God wasn't presenting himself as a static, eternal, immutable being. He was revealing himself as a process, a force in constant movement, the one who transforms, who makes things happen, who is always becoming something new through his creations. Spinoza reread the passage dozens of times. He consulted other texts, other grammars. The conclusion was inescapable. For 3,000 years, the world had believed in a translation that had transformed a dynamic, creative God in constant process of transformation into a static God defined only by his own existence. But why had the translators done this? The answer was obvious and terrifying. A God who defines himself as I am that I am is a distant, absolute, immutable God. A God who demands worship, obedience, submission. A perfect God to sustain religious authorities, hierarchies, dogmas. But a God who presents himself as I will become the one who causes things to become is something completely different. It's a God who is present in every process of transformation, in every movement of nature, in every creative thought. A God who is not separated from the world, but is the active principle that makes the world move, grow, evolve. Such a God doesn't need intermediaries, doesn't demand temples or rituals, is present in every person who thinks, creates, transforms, is present in nature itself, in physical processes, in the movements of celestial bodies, in the growth of plants, in the evolution of ideas. Spinoza understood at that moment why this translation had been hidden. It wasn't just theology, it was revolution. If people knew that God had revealed himself not as a distant and immutable being, but as the active principle present in all transformation, the entire structure of organized religion would crumble. There would no longer be a need for priests to mediate the relationship with the divine. There would no longer be justification for dogmas that limited human thought. There would no longer be reason to separate the sacred from the mundane, the spiritual from the natural, God from creation. God would be recognized as what he really is, according to his own revelation. The creative force present in everything, the one who causes all things to become what they are. Spinoza closed the book and looked out the window. The world outside seemed the same, but for him it had changed completely. Every tree, every stone, every person walking down the street, everything was a manifestation of this God in constant process of creation, of this force that becomes through his own works. He knew this discovery would change his life. He knew that few would have the courage to accept such a radical truth. But he also knew he could no longer live pretending not to know what he had just discovered. The greatest lie in human history had been revealed. And now there was no going back. In the days following his discovery, Spinoza could no longer live normally. Every conversation, every prayer he heard, every sermon that reached his ears, everything sounded false. As if the whole world was participating in a great performance based on a fundamental lie. He tried to continue his routine. Wake up, work on his optical lenses, his livelihood, study philosophy, dine alone. But his mind couldn't free itself from the discovery. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh echoed constantly in his thoughts. It was then that he decided to investigate more deeply. If the translators had changed this fundamental passage, what else had they altered? Spinoza began a systematic analysis of the biblical text, comparing the original Hebrew versions with the most popular translations in Latin, Greek, and vernacular. What he discovered was even more frightening than he had imagined. The distortion wasn't limited to God's name. It was everywhere. In the book of Genesis, for example, the famous passage, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," contained a Hebrew word that had been completely misinterpreted. The word bara, translated as created, didn't mean to create from nothing, like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. It meant to separate and to organize, to give form to what already existed. The original text didn't describe a God creating the universe from absolute nothingness, but an organizing principle giving form and structure to a reality that was already present in some way. God wasn't presented as a creator external to the world, but as the force that organizes, separates, structures what already exists. Once again, the translators had transformed a dynamic and immanent concept into a static and transcendent concept. Spinoza continued his research, and found similar distortions in dozens of other passages. The word ruach, translated as Spirit of God, literally meant wind or breath, not a supernatural entity separate from nature, but the very vital force that moves all things. The Spirit of God was simply the active principle present in all natural movement. The expression image of God, used to describe the creation of man, didn't refer to a physical or spiritual resemblance to an anthropomorphic divine being. The Hebrew word tselem meant active representation. The human being wasn't created in God's likeness, but as an active representation of God, as a manifestation of the divine capacity to transform and create. Each new discovery confirmed the same terrifying conclusion. The original texts presented a vision of God radically different from what had been transmitted by organized religions. Not a supernatural being separated from the world, but the active principle present in all nature. Not an external legislator imposing arbitrary laws, but the immanent rationality that organizes and structures reality. It was at this moment that Spinoza understood why his discovery was so dangerous. If people knew that God had revealed himself as Ihye Asher Ihye, the one who becomes through what he causes to become, all justification for religious authorities would disappear. Why obey priests who claim to speak on behalf of a distant God, when God himself had revealed himself as the active principle present in every thinking person? If people knew that God hadn't created the world from nothing, but was the organizing force present in the world itself, all separation between sacred and profane would lose meaning. Why consider some places, some practices, some people more sacred than others, when everything would be equally a manifestation of divine activity? If people knew that they were created not in the likeness of an anthropomorphic God, but as active representation of divine creative capacity, all justification for hierarchies based on supposed proximity to God would crumble. Each person would be equally capable of expressing divine creativity through their thoughts and actions. Spinoza realized he wasn't dealing with just translation errors. He was facing a millennial conspiracy, not necessarily intentional but systematic, to hide the true nature of God revealed in the original texts. And then, an even more disturbing question occurred to him. If the translators had systematically distorted the presentation that God made of himself, what else had they hidden? What other fundamental truths had been buried under layers of interpretations convenient for religious power? At this moment, looking at you who follow this discovery, Spinoza would whisper, "Can you imagine what the world would be like if people knew who God really said he is? If they knew that he isn't in a distant heaven, but present in every creative thought, in every act of transformation, in every moment of growth and evolution?" Write in the comments, after knowing that I am isn't what God said, what other religious truths do you now question? What other translations might be hiding transformative realities? And if you're feeling that you need this journey of discovery, that you need to know how far this revelation goes, subscribe to the channel now, because we're just beginning to unearth the secrets that shaped human civilization, and you deserve to know the truth that has been hidden for so long. The discovery about God's true name was just the beginning. Spinoza soon realized he was facing something much bigger than isolated translation errors. He was discovering a systematic pattern of distortions that had shaped all Western understanding of spirituality, morality, and human nature itself. His next investigation led him to one of the most fundamental questions of human existence: what happens when we die? For centuries, Christianity had promised eternal life for the righteous and eternal punishment for sinners. Traditional Judaism also spoke of rewards and punishments after death. Islam structured all its ethics around paradise and hell. All these religions based their doctrines on biblical interpretations about the nature of the soul and human destiny after death. But when Spinoza examined the original Hebrew texts, he found something completely different. The word that had been translated as soul in the biblical texts was nephesh. However, nephesh didn't mean an immortal substance separated from the body, as the translations suggested. It simply meant life, breath, vitality, the active principle that animates a living body. When the Bible said that God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life and man became a living soul, the original text wasn't describing the insertion of an immortal substance into a mortal body. It was describing the moment when organized matter became capable of living, breathing, acting, the moment when the divine vital force itself was expressed through a specific physical form. The soul, according to the original texts, wasn't something the person had. It was what the person was when alive and active. This discovery completely revolutionized understanding about death. If the soul was simply the vitality present in a living body, then death wasn't the separation between soul and body, but the end of the organization that allowed life to be expressed through that specific form. But this didn't mean total annihilation. Spinoza discovered that the original texts presented a much more sophisticated vision. The vital force that had been expressed through a specific person didn't disappear with death. It returned to the universal active principle from which it had emerged, not as a preserved individual personality, but as creative energy reintegrated into the cosmic process of continuous transformation. It was like a wave that, when breaking on the shore, doesn't cease to exist. It simply returns to the ocean from which it had temporarily emerged. This vision eliminated both the fear of total annihilation and the fantasy of eternal personal survival. Death became simply a natural transformation, the return of individual vital energy to the universal cosmic process. But the implications of this discovery went far beyond the question of death. If there was no immortal soul separated from the body, then the entire basis of traditional religious morality crumbled. Organized religions had built their ethical systems around rewards and punishments after death. Be good to gain paradise, avoid evil to escape hell. All morality was based on fear of eternal punishment or hope of eternal reward. But if the original texts promised neither threatened eternal life after death, then what would be the basis of ethics? Spinoza found the answer in a Hebrew word that had been systematically mistranslated, tzedek. This word had been translated as justice in the legalistic sense, conformity with divine laws that would be rewarded after death. But tzedek didn't mean obedience to external commands. It meant adequacy, harmony, correct functioning, acting according to each being's genuine nature. Original biblical ethics wasn't based on obedience to external laws, but on understanding one's own nature and acting in harmony with it. Being ethical meant fully realizing what one is by nature, completely expressing the divine creative force present in each person. This discovery transformed morality from a system of external prohibitions into a process of self-knowledge and self-realization. It was no longer about obeying commands to avoid punishment, but about understanding one's own nature to live fully and creatively. Spinoza realized this was the true revolution hidden in the original texts. Not just a new theology, but a new anthropology. The human being wasn't presented as a sinner needing external salvation, but as an expression of divine creativity itself, capable of understanding his nature and living ethically through this understanding. But there was still more. If ethics wasn't based on rewards and punishments after death, but on full realization of human nature in this life, then the very notions of good and evil needed to be rethought. Spinoza discovered that the Hebrew words translated as good and evil, tovi and ra, didn't carry absolute moral connotations. Tov meant adequate, functional, that which promotes life and growth. Ra meant inadequate, dysfunctional, that which impedes growth and realization. Good and evil weren't absolute metaphysical categories, but practical evaluations of what promotes or impedes the flourishing of life. An action was good if it contributed to growth, creativity, realization of natural potentialities. It was evil if it prevented this flourishing. This perspective eliminated both rigid moralism and radical relativism. There were clear criteria for evaluating actions, but these criteria were based on empirical observation of what promotes or impedes human flourishing, not on arbitrary commands from external authorities. Spinoza understood he had discovered not just distortions in biblical translations, but a complete system of thought that had been systematically obscured, a system that presented God as immanent creative process, the human being as expression of divine creativity, ethics as realization of genuine nature, and life as opportunity to fully express the creative potentialities present in each person. This vision didn't eliminate the sacred, it intensified it. But it transferred the sacred from institutions and rituals to life itself, to every creative act, to every moment of growth and understanding. It was spirituality without superstition, ethics without moralism, religion without dogmas. It was, Spinoza realized, what the original biblical texts really taught before being distorted to sustain structures of religious power. And this led him to an even more radical question. If so much had been systematically distorted, did the very history of revelation need to be retold? The discovery that not only God's name but also the nature of the soul and morality had been systematically distorted led Spinoza to an even bolder investigation. He decided to examine the very history of biblical revelation to determine what had really happened in the formative events of the great religions. His first question was, who was Moses really? Religious traditions presented Moses as a supernatural leader, capable of impossible miracles, direct receiver of divine laws carved in stone by God himself. But when Spinoza examined the original texts with critical eyes, he found a very different story. The Moses of the original texts was presented not as a performer of supernatural miracles, but as a political and philosophical genius who had understood something revolutionary about the nature of reality and social organization. The burning bush passage, when read in Hebrew without traditional distortions, revealed not an encounter with a supernatural being, but a moment of profound insight about the nature of the creative force present in all natural processes. Moses hadn't conversed with an external entity. He had intuitively understood the nature of the active principle that organizes and transforms all things. When God revealed himself as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the one who becomes through what he causes to become, Moses was discovering that the force responsible for all transformation and growth wasn't a distant legislator, but the rational principle present in nature and in the human mind. This understanding transformed Moses into a revolutionary leader. He realized that if this creative principle was present in all human beings, then it was possible to create a society based not on obedience to external authorities, but on rational understanding and voluntary cooperation. The famous tablets of the law hadn't been supernaturally carved on a mountain. They were developed by Moses as an ethical code based on his understanding of human nature and the principles necessary for a just and prosperous society. The 10 Commandments weren't arbitrary orders from a cosmic legislator, but practical discoveries about what promotes or impedes the flourishing of a human community. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. Not because an external God had so ordered, but because these actions are destructive to any society that wants to prosper. Spinoza discovered that all Mosaic legislation could be understood this way, not as supernatural revelation, but as one of the first attempts in human history to create a social system based on reason and understanding of human nature, instead of based only on force and traditional authority. But there was more. The original text suggested that Moses had understood something even more revolutionary, that this capacity to rationally understand the nature of things and act according to this understanding was present in principle in all human beings. The expression chosen people didn't refer to an arbitrary selection made by a tribal god, but to the fact that the Israelites had chosen to accept a way of life based on reason and ethics, instead of living only under the authority of brute force like other peoples of the time. They were chosen, not by God, but by themselves, by choosing to live according to rational principles instead of merely following traditions or obeying absolutist kings. This interpretation explained why the Israelites were constantly warned against idolatry. It wasn't about divine jealousy against other gods, but a warning against the human tendency to substitute rational understanding for submission to external authorities, whether they be stone images, autocratic kings, or even dogmatic interpretations of the Mosaic tradition itself. True idolatry was abandoning the capacity to think for oneself and submitting blindly to any external authority, whether it be a statue, a king, or a priest. Spinoza realized this understanding transformed all biblical history. The great characters weren't performers of supernatural miracles, but individuals who had understood important aspects of human nature and social organization, and had tried to implement these understandings in their communities. Abraham hadn't conversed with an external God who promised him lands and descendants. He had understood that universal ethical principles were more important than local tribal traditions, and had created a new form of social organization based on this understanding. Isaac and Jacob weren't passive receivers of divine promises, but continuators of the Abrahamic project of developing forms of social life based on universal ethical principles instead of particular tribal customs. The prophets weren't receivers of supernatural messages, but thinkers who had understood the social and political consequences of abandoning rational ethical principles. Their prophecies were predictions based on empirical observation. Societies that abandon justice and cooperation inevitably enter decline and conflict. The entire biblical narrative was revealed as the history of a revolutionary social experiment, the attempt to create human communities based on reason, ethics, and understanding of human nature, instead of based only on tradition, authority, and force. And the most impressive, this experiment had been partially successful. The original biblical texts preserved profound insights about human psychology, social organization, and ethical principles that remained valid millennia later. But these insights had been systematically obscured by supernatural interpretations that transformed them into religious dogmas. What had been discovered as rational understanding was transformed into irrational belief. What had been developed as universal ethical principles was transformed into particular religious laws. Spinoza understood he wasn't just correcting wrong translations. He was recovering a lost intellectual tradition, a tradition that had anticipated by millennia many of the discoveries of modern philosophy and science about human nature and social organization. The ancient Hebrews, according to the original texts, had understood that human beings are expressions of the creative force present in nature, capable of rationally understanding their own nature and organizing societies based on this understanding. They had discovered that ethics needn't be based on external authorities, but can be developed through empirical understanding of what promotes or impedes human flourishing. They had realized that true spirituality doesn't consist of rituals and beliefs, but in the full realization of the creative capacities present in each person. These discoveries had been revolutionary in their time. They continued to be revolutionary in Spinoza's time. And perhaps they were even more revolutionary today, in an era when humanity has the scientific knowledge and technological possibilities to implement these understandings on a global scale. The discovery that the original biblical texts contained a rational philosophy, systematically hidden by supernatural interpretations, led Spinoza to an even deeper investigation. If Moses and the ancient Hebrews had really developed such advanced insights about human and social nature, how and why were these insights lost? The answer, Spinoza discovered, was in the very history of the Jewish people after Moses. The original biblical texts, when read without traditional interpretative distortions, told a fascinating story about the conflict between two radically different visions of religion and society. On one side was the original Mosaic vision, a society based on rational understanding, universal ethics, realization of human creative capacities, a community where each person would be capable of understanding and applying the principles of ethical life without need for authoritarian intermediaries. On the other side was constant pressure to return to traditional models, autocratic kings, priests who monopolized religious knowledge, rituals that substituted rational understanding for blind submission. The texts showed this conflict happening generation after generation. Every time the Israelites prospered following original Mosaic principles, the temptation arose to be like other nations, to have powerful kings, grandiose temples, organized priesthoods. The decisive moment, according to Spinoza, was the institution of monarchy. When the Israelites asked for a king to be like other nations, they were abandoning the revolutionary project of a society based on reason and opting for the familiar security of traditional authority. The original texts preserved Samuel's warning against this choice. A king, he predicted, would establish a costly court, charge heavy taxes, create a privileged aristocracy, militarize society, and gradually transform a free people into a population of subjects. And that's exactly what happened. With monarchy came the great temples, organized priesthoods, elaborate rituals. Religion was gradually transformed from a system of ethical understanding into an institution of social control. The biblical texts themselves documented this transformation. The first books, Genesis, Exodus, parts of Leviticus, preserved elements of the original Mosaic vision, but later books showed an increasingly institutionalized, ritualized religion centered on the Jerusalem temple and the Levitic priesthood. Spinoza realized that many of the laws attributed to Moses had been created centuries later by temple priests to justify their authority and privileges. The laws about sacrifices, for example, didn't appear in the oldest texts. They were added later to ensure the people remained dependent on priestly services. Most revealing was that the biblical prophets themselves constantly denounced this corruption of the original vision. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos all criticized excess rituals and neglect of social ethics. All called the people back to original principles of justice and rational understanding. But their criticisms were always reinterpreted by religious authorities as calls for more orthodoxy, more obedience, more submission, exactly the opposite of what the prophets were really preaching. The final blow to the original Mosaic vision came with the Babylonian exile. When the temple was destroyed and the people were deported, religious leaders realized they needed to create a form of Judaism that could survive without national territory and without centralized institutions. The solution was to transform oral tradition into a religion of the book. The texts that had preserved the original Mosaic vision were edited, reinterpreted, and systematized in a form that emphasized obedience to written laws instead of rational understanding of ethical principles. This was the origin of the Torah as we know it today. Not a text supernaturally revealed to Moses, but an edited compilation centuries after the exile, which mixed genuinely ancient elements with later interpretations created to sustain religious authority in a situation of dispersion. The editors did sophisticated work. They preserved sufficient elements of the original tradition to maintain historical legitimacy, but reinterpreted everything in ways that transformed rational insights into religious dogmas. The result was a religion that maintained the language of the original Mosaic tradition, but had completely inverted its spirit. Where Moses had taught rational understanding, later editors emphasized blind obedience. Where the original tradition promoted ethical autonomy, the edited version demanded submission to authorities. Where ancient texts celebrated human capacity to understand and apply universal principles, later interpretations emphasized the need for specialized intermediaries. Spinoza realized the same process had occurred later with Christianity and Islam. Both began with revolutionary insights about spirituality and ethics, but were gradually institutionalized and dogmatized until they became systems of social control instead of traditions of understanding and growth. Jesus, according to Spinoza, had understood and tried to restore the original Mosaic vision. His criticisms of the Pharisees and Sadducees were criticisms of institutionalized religion that had substituted understanding for ritual, ethics for legalism, spiritual growth for external obedience. Jesus' original message was that the kingdom of heaven wasn't a place to go after death, but a way of living based on understanding that divine creative force is present in each person. It was possible, according to Jesus, to live ethically and creatively without need for religious intermediaries, relating directly to the divine principle present in one's own consciousness. But this message was quickly reinterpreted by Jesus' followers in ways that restored the need for religious authorities, special rituals, and dogmatic beliefs. Institutional Christianity transformed Jesus from a teacher of ethical wisdom into an object of worship, and his message of spiritual autonomy into a religion of dependence and submission. Islam went through the same process. Muhammad had tried to restore a spirituality based on rational understanding and universal ethics, criticizing both Arab paganism and institutionalized forms of Judaism and Christianity of his time. But Islam was quickly transformed into an institutional religion with the same authoritarian characteristics that Muhammad had criticized. Spinoza understood he had discovered a fundamental historical pattern. Periodically, individuals appeared who understood important aspects of human nature and spirituality and tried to create movements based on this understanding. But these movements were invariably captured by people interested in institutional power, who transformed rational insights into religious dogmas and ethical understanding into systems of social control. Humanity's true spiritual tradition wasn't preserved in official religious institutions, but in elements of ancient texts that had survived dogmatic reinterpretations. And these elements, when correctly understood, pointed to spirituality based on reason, ethics, and realization of human creative capacities, not on submission to external authorities. This discovery put Spinoza in a very dangerous position. He wasn't just criticizing incorrect translations or questionable interpretations. He was exposing the entire system through which institutional religions maintained authority and social control. And this explained why his discovery about God's true name was so threatening to the religious authorities of his time. Understanding how the original Mosaic vision had been systematically distorted over the centuries led Spinoza to an even more radical conclusion. If true biblical spirituality was based on reason and understanding of nature, then it wasn't incompatible with modern science. It was its precursor. Spinoza began to perceive that the insights preserved in the original biblical texts anticipated many of the discoveries being made by philosophers and scientists of his own time. The conception of God as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the one who becomes through what he causes to become, was surprisingly similar to the emerging understanding of nature as a dynamic system of forces in constant interaction and transformation. When the original texts presented God as the active principle present in all natural processes, they were anticipating the discovery that there is an immanent rationality in nature itself, physical and mathematical laws that organize and structure all natural phenomena. When they described the human being as image of God, active representation of divine creative capacity, they were recognizing that humans are the part of nature that became capable of rationally understanding its own functioning and the functioning of the cosmos. Spinoza realized he was facing an extraordinary possibility, reunifying science and spirituality, not by denying one in favor of the other, but by showing that both, when correctly understood, point to the same fundamental reality. Modern science was discovering that the universe is a rationally structured system, governed by precise mathematical laws, where everything is interconnected in a complex network of causes and effects. Original biblical spirituality, when freed from supernatural distortions, presented exactly the same vision, a reality where everything is expression of a unique rational principle, where each part is connected to the whole, where understanding this connection is the basis of both science and ethics. This unification eliminated both reductionist materialism and supernatural spiritualism. Reality was neither dead matter governed by blind forces, nor ethereal spirit separated from the physical world. It was a dynamic system where matter and mind, nature and rationality were inseparable aspects of the same fundamental reality. Spinoza began to develop a philosophy that would express this unification. If God was really the one who becomes through what he causes to become, then God wasn't an entity separated from the world, but the very process through which the world exists, evolves and understands itself. Nature wasn't God's creation. It was God expressing himself, becoming, realizing himself through increasingly complex and sophisticated forms. From the physical laws that govern planetary movements to human consciousness capable of understanding these laws, everything was manifestation of the same fundamental creativity. Human beings weren't creatures separate from God who needed to connect with him through rituals and beliefs. They were the form through which God becomes conscious of himself. When a person understands a natural law, develops a creative idea or acts ethically, God is literally knowing himself and expressing himself through that person. This perspective completely transformed the relationship between religion and science. Studying nature scientifically wasn't impiety, it was a form of knowing God directly. Developing technologies that improve human life wasn't materialism, it was participating in divine creativity. Living ethically wasn't obedience to external commands, it was authentically expressing the divine nature present in each person. Spinoza realized this philosophy resolved many of the conflicts that tormented his time. It wasn't necessary to choose between faith and reason. Both were aspects of the same search to understand and express the fundamental nature of reality. It wasn't necessary to choose between spirituality and naturalism. Nature itself, correctly understood, was spiritual. But there was still more. If human beings were really manifestations of divine creativity, then each person had not only the right, but the responsibility to fully develop their rational and creative capacities. Repressing thought, creativity, or the search for understanding wasn't just harmful to the individual. It was literally preventing God from knowing and expressing himself through that person. This made intellectual freedom not just a practical necessity, but a religious imperative. A truly spiritual society would be one that maximally promoted the development of human capacities to understand, create, and grow. Spinoza began to envision the possibility of a civilization based on this understanding, a society where science and spirituality would complement instead of conflicting, where education would be aimed not just at transmitting information, but at developing each person's creative and ethical capacities, where political organization would promote the conditions necessary for everyone to fully realize their potentialities. It would be a society where true religiosity would be measured not by orthodoxy of beliefs or obedience to rituals, but by each person's contribution to the growth of knowledge, creativity, and human cooperation. A society where governors would be chosen not for claiming to have divine authority, but for their capacity to create conditions that allow human flourishing. Where laws would be based not on arbitrary traditions, but on empirical understanding of what promotes or impedes the development of human capacities. This vision was simultaneously deeply conservative and radically revolutionary. Conservative because it recovered fundamental insights from humanity's oldest spiritual traditions. Revolutionary because it applied these insights in ways that would completely transform existing social, political, and religious structures. Spinoza knew this vision would face opposition from both religious authoritarians and reductionist materialists. The former would reject it because it eliminated the need for intermediaries between people and God. The latter because it recognized spiritual dimensions in nature itself, but he also knew he could no longer live pretending not to have discovered these connections. The truth about God's name had opened a door that could no longer be closed, a door to an understanding of reality that unified everything he most valued: reason and spirituality, science and ethics, individual freedom and social responsibility. There remained only the question of how to communicate these discoveries in ways that could be understood and implemented, how to transform philosophical insights into practical changes in how people live and organize socially. The discovery that science and spirituality could be unified in a broader understanding of reality placed Spinoza before an immense practical dilemma: how to communicate these ideas in an era dominated by conflict between religious authority and rational knowledge. It was 1675, and Europe was devastated by religious wars that had lasted more than a century. Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in the name of different interpretations of the same biblical texts. The Inquisition burned anyone who questioned official doctrines. Governments used religion to justify absolute power over their subjects. In this context, Spinoza's discoveries were explosively dangerous, not just for him personally, but for the entire social structure of his time. If people discovered that God had revealed himself as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the one who becomes through what he causes to become, all justification for intermediary religious authorities would disappear. If they understood that true spirituality consists in developing rational and creative capacities, not in obedience to dogmas, the entire system of religious control would collapse. But Spinoza also perceived that simply publishing his discoveries would result only in his death and the definitive burial of the truths he had unearthed. He needed a more subtle strategy. He decided to write two types of work. One explicit, which would present his philosophical ideas systematically but abstractly, directed at intellectuals capable of understanding the implications without needing detailed practical applications. Another implicit, which would preserve his discoveries about biblical texts in ways that could be recovered by future generations when humanity was more prepared to implement them. The explicit work would become the Ethics, a geometric demonstration of how reality functions, from the most fundamental principles to the most practical applications for human life. A complete system of philosophy that would show how to understand one's own nature and live according to this understanding. But Spinoza knew the ethics would be understood by very few people of his time. It was a work for the future, for a humanity that had developed sufficient intellectual maturity to integrate reason and spirituality without falling into either religious dogmatism or reductionist materialism. For his time, he would write something different, the Theological Political Treatise, a work that would present his discoveries about biblical texts in apparently academic form as erudite textual criticism, without completely explicating the revolutionary implications. In the treatise, Spinoza would show that biblical texts were historical documents produced by human beings in specific contexts, not supernatural revelations directly dictated by God. He would show that they contained valuable insights about ethics and social organization, but that these insights had been distorted by later dogmatic interpretations. This approach would allow intelligent readers to understand the broader implications without Spinoza needing to state them explicitly. Those who had sufficient capacity and courage could reconnect the dots and arrive at the same revolutionary conclusions. But even this strategy was dangerous. Spinoza knew he would be attacked by both religious authorities and materialist atheists. The former would accuse him of destroying religion, the latter of not going far enough in criticism. In reality, he was doing something much more radical than either of these positions. He was showing that true religion, the original understanding preserved in ancient texts, wasn't incompatible with reason, but was its deepest expression. And that true atheism wasn't in the denial of God, but in the worship of idols, including intellectual idols created by both religious dogmatism and materialist reductionism. While writing, Spinoza also developed a careful network of correspondents who could understand and preserve his ideas. Intellectuals like Henry Oldenburg, Gottfried Leibniz, Ehrenfried Walter von Schirnhaus, people who might not completely agree with his conclusions, but who had sufficient intellectual capacity to understand their importance and preserve them for the future. At the same time, he continued his daily life as an optical lens polisher. Ironically, this work became a perfect metaphor for his philosophical activity. Just as he could take a piece of raw glass and polish it until it became a lens that allowed clear vision of distant objects, he was taking ancient texts obscured by distorted interpretations and polishing them until they revealed clear insights about the nature of reality. His optical lenses were used by the most advanced scientists of his time, including Christian Huygens himself, to make revolutionary astronomical discoveries. His philosophical lenses would allow future generations to make equally revolutionary discoveries about the nature of spirituality and social organization, but the work was solitary and dangerous. Spinoza lived in constant tension between the desire to share his discoveries and the need to protect himself from persecution. He knew he had access to truths that could transform human civilization, but he also knew that expressing these truths too directly could result not only in his own destruction, but in the definitive burial of the discoveries. The solution was to develop what he internally called the seeding strategy. Instead of trying to convince his generation of the truth of his discoveries, he would seed these discoveries in ways that could germinate in more propitious times. He would write in such a way that superficial readers would see only academic criticisms of traditional biblical interpretations, but deeper readers could recognize the revolutionary implications and develop these implications when circumstances permitted. This way, the truths he had discovered about God's name, about the nature of authentic spirituality, about the possibility of unifying reason and religion, about the principles of a truly ethical society, all these discoveries would remain available for future generations that had developed sufficient maturity to implement them. It was a long-term strategy. Spinoza was planting intellectual seeds that might only germinate centuries later. But it was the only way to preserve such fundamental discoveries in an era dominated by intolerance and conflict. While writing, one question continued to haunt him. Would humanity ever be capable of accepting the truth about its own spiritual nature? Would the time come when people could live according to the original insights preserved in ancient texts without need for intermediary authorities or restrictive dogmas? He didn't know if he would see that time in his lifetime, but he knew he had the responsibility to do everything he could to make it possible. Spinoza's last years were marked by profound solitude, but also by extraordinary clarity. At 40-something, he knew tuberculosis was consuming his lungs, that he probably didn't have much more time, but he also knew he had discovered truths that could change the world if they were correctly understood and implemented. In his last letters, he wrote with growing urgency. Not about his imminent death, he accepted this with a serenity that impressed his few friends, but about how to ensure his discoveries would survive and eventually bear fruit. The publication of the theological political treatise had provoked exactly the reaction he expected. Scandal, condemnation, prohibition. Religious authorities denounced him as a dangerous atheist. Materialist atheists criticized him for not completely rejecting religion. Very few people understood what he was really trying to do: recover authentic spirituality from the original texts. But this didn't discourage him. On the contrary, it confirmed that his ideas were sufficiently revolutionary to disturb all established power systems, and that meant they were sufficiently powerful to eventually transform these systems. In one of his last letters, he wrote something that revealed the core of everything he had discovered. When people understand that God really said, "I will become the one who causes things to become," they will realize they are participants in the continuous creation of the world, not just passive observers or beneficiaries of an already completed creation. This simple phrase contained the entire revolution. If God is the one who becomes through what he causes to become, then every human act of creation, understanding, or transformation is literally God expressing himself through that person. Every scientific discovery, every work of art, every act of kindness, every moment of personal growth, all of this is divinity becoming more conscious of itself, more creative, more capable of transforming and improving reality. This completely eliminated the separation between sacred and secular, between spiritual and material, between religious and scientific. Everything that promotes life, understanding, creativity, and cooperation is sacred. Everything that impedes the growth and realization of human potentialities is literally contrary to divine will. Spinoza realized this understanding would completely transform the way human beings relate to work, study, personal relationships, politics, art, science. If each person is a unique expression of divine creativity, then each person has not only the right but the responsibility to fully develop their particular capacities. A society based on this understanding would be radically different from anything that had existed. It would be a society where education would be aimed at discovering and developing each person's unique talents, not forcing everyone into the same standardized form. It would be a society where work would be organized so that each person could contribute through what they do best and what they most love to do, not through tasks imposed by necessity or authority. It would be a society where politics would be organized around the question, how can we create conditions that allow each person to fully realize their potentialities, not around disputes for power or control. It would be a society where religion would consist in celebrating and developing the divine creativity present in each person, not in obedience to dogmas or submission to authorities. It would be, Spinoza realized, the society that Moses had tried to create when he received the revelation of God's true name. A society where each person would be capable of relating directly to the divine principle present in their own consciousness, without need for authoritarian intermediaries. But for this society to become possible, it would be necessary for sufficient people to understand the truth about their own spiritual nature. And for this to happen, it would be necessary for the discoveries about the original biblical texts to be preserved and eventually widely disseminated. Spinoza knew he wouldn't live to see this happen, but he also knew he had done everything he could to make it possible. He had deciphered the code. He had discovered the interpretive keys. He had documented his discoveries in ways that could be recovered and developed by future generations. In his last months of life, he worked feverishly on finalizing the ethics. He knew this work would be his most lasting contribution, a complete system of philosophy based on understanding that reality is a dynamic process where matter and mind, nature and rationality, individual and universal, are inseparable aspects of the same fundamental substance. When the ethics was finally understood, people would realize that Spinoza had developed the complete philosophical implications of the original Mosaic revelation. He had shown how it's possible to live according to understanding that each person is a unique expression of divine creativity. On the morning of February 21st, 1677, Baruch Spinoza died peacefully in his modest house. His few possessions included his instruments for polishing lenses, a small library, and the manuscripts that contained the most revolutionary discoveries in human history. The manuscripts were preserved by friends who understood their importance, even without fully understanding their implications. The Ethics was published anonymously a few months later, The theological political treatise continued circulating clandestinely. The seeds were planted. It remained only to wait for them to germinate at the right time, when humanity was ready to accept the truth about its own divine nature. 350 years later, perhaps that time has come. The 18th century arrived and passed. The Enlightenment shook Europe with ideas that echoed, without most people realizing it, Spinoza's buried discoveries. Voltaire attacked religious superstition. Diderot and d'Alembert compiled all human knowledge in an encyclopedia that challenged traditional authorities. Kant tried to reconcile reason and morality in a revolutionary philosophical synthesis. But there was something none of these great thinkers had noticed: the interpretive keys that Spinoza had left hidden in his texts, waiting for someone to discover them and apply them to the questions of a more mature era. It was only in the 19th century that some began to suspect that Spinoza had discovered something much more radical than his explicit works revealed. Hegel realized there was a Spinozan substance that unified nature and spirit more profoundly than any previous philosophy. Marx intuited that Spinoza's ideas about human nature contained revolutionary implications for social organization. Nietzsche sensed that Spinoza had anticipated the need for a revaluation of all values, but none of them had discovered the main key: the revelation about God's true name and its implications for understanding spirituality, science, and politics. This discovery had to wait until the 20th century, when developments in quantum physics and psychology began to reveal aspects of reality that seemed to confirm fundamental Spinozan intuitions. Physics discovered that matter and energy are aspects of the same reality, that observer and observed are fundamentally interconnected, that nature itself seems to have an intrinsic mathematical structure that suggests immanent rationality in the cosmos. Psychology discovered that the human mind has creative and intuitive capacities that go far beyond what was imagined, that there exists an intelligence that operates through human beings, but seems to transcend individual limitations. These developments created, for the first time since Spinoza's era, a cultural context where his most radical discoveries could be understood and applied. And it was then that some scholars began to reread Spinoza with new eyes, looking for the clues he had left about his deepest discoveries. The first clue was in an apparently obscure passage of the Ethics, where Spinoza writes, "The human mind is an idea of God." At first glance, this seemed merely an abstract metaphysical formulation, but when connected with his discoveries about God's true name, it revealed something revolutionary. If God is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the one who becomes through what he causes to become, then the human mind isn't just an idea of God, but the process through which God becomes conscious of himself. Every creative thought, every insight, every understanding is literally God knowing himself through that particular mind. This meant that the evolution of human consciousness is the evolution of divine consciousness. When humanity develops more sophisticated sciences, deeper philosophies, more expressive arts, more just social systems, God is literally becoming more conscious, more creative, more capable of expressing his potentialities through physical forms. The second clue was in Spinoza's theory of affects. Spinoza had developed a detailed psychology of human emotional processes, showing how certain emotions promote growth and creativity, while others impede them. But when this theory was connected with the revelation about God's name, it revealed something even deeper: a spiritual technology for tuning individual consciousness with the universal creative process. The joyful affects, love, admiration, hope, courage, generosity, weren't just beneficial psychological states. They were literally forms of individual consciousness, aligning with divine creativity. When a person feels genuine joy, they are directly experiencing the satisfaction God feels in expressing himself creatively through that person. The sad affects, fear, anger, envy, resentment, despair, weren't just harmful psychological states. They were forms of individual consciousness becoming misaligned with the universal creative process, preventing God from fully expressing himself through that person. The third clue was in Spinozan political theory. In the political treatise, Spinoza had outlined principles for a society based on reason and voluntary cooperation. But when these principles were connected with his discoveries about divine nature, they revealed the blueprint for a completely new civilization. If each person is a unique expression of divine creativity, then the purpose of any social system should be to maximize the conditions that allow each person to develop and fully express their particular capacities. This didn't mean anarchic individualism. On the contrary, it meant a very sophisticated type of organic cooperation, where each person contributes through what they do best and where the system as a whole is organized to promote the flourishing of all participants. It would be a society where education would be personalized to discover and develop each child's unique talents, where work would be organized so that each person could contribute through their most developed capacities and most authentic passions, where governance would be based on empirical understanding of what promotes or impedes human flourishing, not on arbitrary traditions or interests of privileged groups. It would be a society where religion wouldn't consist of rituals and dogmas, but in celebrating and developing the divine creativity present in each person, where science would be understood as a form of knowing God directly through studying his natural manifestations, where art would be seen as conscious collaboration with the universal creative process. When these three clues were connected, the nature of mind as the process through which God knows himself, the technology of affects for tuning with divine creativity, and political principles for a society based on human flourishing, an integrated vision emerged of a spiritual civilization based on reason and creativity. This vision was simultaneously profoundly mystical and rigorously scientific. It recognized fundamental spiritual dimensions in reality, but located these dimensions in nature itself and in human consciousness itself, not in supernatural realms separated from the physical world. It was a spirituality that celebrated incarnation instead of seeking escape from it, a religiosity that saw the development of human capacities as direct collaboration with God, a mysticism that found the divine not through denial of the world, but through its creative transformation. And most extraordinary, this vision didn't require people to abandon science, technology, or rational thought. On the contrary, it required them to develop these capacities to the maximum, understanding them as direct expressions of their spiritual nature. For the first time in history, a civilization seemed possible that would fully integrate spirituality and rationality, mysticism and science, individual development and social cooperation. But for this possibility to become reality, it would be necessary for sufficient people to understand and implement the discoveries that Spinoza had preserved in his encrypted texts. In the 21st century, something extraordinary began to happen. Developments in neuroscience, quantum physics, transpersonal psychology, and complex systems began to reveal aspects of reality that seemed to confirm, with surprising precision, Spinoza's deepest intuitions about the nature of mind, matter, and the relationship between both. Neuroscience discovered that the brain isn't just a biological computer processing information, but a complex system that seems to have access to forms of intelligence that transcend known neural mechanisms. Studies on creativity, intuition, and expanded states of consciousness revealed that the human mind can function in ways that suggest connection with broader intelligence. Quantum physics revealed that fundamental reality doesn't consist of separate particles interacting mechanically, but of interconnected energy fields, where information and matter are inseparable aspects of the same underlying reality. Transpersonal psychology documented experiences where individuals report direct access to knowledge and capacities that seem to transcend the limitations of individual personality, suggesting that human consciousness may be local manifestation of more universal consciousness. Complex systems studies showed that organized structures can emerge spontaneously when individual components cooperate according to simple principles, creating forms of collective intelligence that transcend the capabilities of isolated elements. Each of these discoveries in isolation could be interpreted in various ways. But when considered together, they pointed to an understanding of reality surprisingly similar to what Spinoza had developed 3 centuries before, a universe where consciousness and matter are inseparable aspects of a fundamental creative process, where individual beings are local manifestations of universal intelligence, where cooperation based on rational understanding can generate emergent forms of collective creativity. It was in this context that some researchers began to reread Spinoza, not just as a historical philosopher, but as someone who had anticipated fundamental discoveries about the nature of reality that were only now being confirmed empirically. And it was then that someone finally completely decoded the clues Spinoza had left about his deepest discoveries. The decoding began with careful analysis of Spinoza's correspondence, particularly his letters about interpreting biblical texts. In these letters, he had left coded references to his discoveries about the true meaning of key passages, including clues about God's name revealed to Moses. When these clues were followed and applied to the original Hebrew texts, using modern methods of linguistic analysis and textual criticism, discoveries emerged that confirmed and expanded everything Spinoza had intuited. The name Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh proved even more revolutionary than Spinoza had realized. Modern linguistic analyses showed that the Hebrew construction doesn't express just future or continuous process, but specifically becoming through self-causation, a concept that anticipates by millennia modern discoveries about self-organization and emergence in complex systems. God hadn't revealed himself just as the one who becomes through what he causes to become, but as the one who causes himself by becoming through what he causes to become. A precise definition of what modern systems call autocatalysis, processes that create and develop themselves through their own activity. This discovery completely transformed understanding of the relationship between God and the world. God didn't create the world and then withdraw to observe it from outside. God becomes through the world. Every process of growth, every emergence of complexity, every development of consciousness is literally God self-causing through his own manifestations. This meant that cosmic evolution, from the formation of stars and planets to the development of life and consciousness, isn't just a blind physical process, but the very process through which God develops and becomes conscious of himself. Life isn't an accident in a mechanical universe. It's the form through which the universe develops sensitivity. Consciousness isn't an epiphenomenon emerging from material processes. It's the form through which the universe becomes conscious of itself. Human creativity isn't just a useful biological capacity. It's the form through which the universe develops its capacity to consciously transform itself. When this understanding was applied to other Spinozan discoveries about the nature of mind, affects and social organization, an integrated vision emerged that offered answers to some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. The question about the meaning of life received a clear answer. The purpose of life is to consciously participate in the process through which the universe develops and understands itself. Each person has a unique contribution to make to this cosmic process. The question about how to live ethically received a practical answer. Act in ways that maximize your own creativity and the creativity of others. Develop your deepest capacities and help others develop theirs. Contribute to processes that promote growth, understanding, and cooperation. The question about how to organize societies received a systematic answer. Create structures that allow each person to discover and develop their unique capacities, that promote cooperation based on complementarity of different talents, that direct resources and energy to support the flourishing of all participants. The question about the relationship between science and spirituality received a unified answer. Both are aspects of the same process of knowing and developing reality. Science studies how the universe works. Spirituality participates in the process through which the universe develops. Both are necessary for complete understanding, but perhaps the most revolutionary discovery was realizing that this vision wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was a practical program for civilizational transformation. If the intuition was correct, that human beings are the form through which the universe is becoming conscious of itself, then the evolution of human consciousness is literally cosmic evolution. The development of more sophisticated forms of knowledge, creativity, and cooperation isn't just human progress, it's universal evolution. This suggested that humanity was in a position of extraordinary cosmic responsibility. The choices we make about how to develop our science, our art, our social organization don't affect only human life on Earth. They affect the very process through which the universe develops, and this, in turn, suggested that the time had come to consciously apply Spinozan discoveries about how to promote human flourishing on a planetary scale. The discovery that humanity might be in a position of cosmic responsibility brought new urgency to practical questions about how to implement Spinozan intuitions on a civilizational scale. If human beings are really the form through which the universe is becoming conscious of itself, then how do we organize societies that maximize this potentiality? The answer began to emerge when some visionaries of the 21st century started applying Spinozan principles to concrete challenges of modern social organization. The first principle was that each person is a unique expression of universal creativity with a specific contribution to make to collective development. This meant that social systems should be organized to discover, develop, and apply each individual's unique talents. In practice, this required an educational revolution. Instead of standardized systems that try to force all children into the same form, it would be necessary to develop personalized processes of talent discovery. Each child would need opportunities to explore different types of intelligence, different forms of creativity, different ways of contributing to collective good. This didn't mean anarchic individualism. On the contrary, it meant understanding that true individuality develops through contribution to projects larger than the individual. Each person would discover their unique talent through participation in collective enterprises that promoted general flourishing. The second principle was that genuine cooperation emerges when complementary people work together on projects that transcend purely personal interests. This meant that economic and political structures should be organized around inspiring collective projects, not just around distributing scarce resources. In practice, this required an economic revolution. Instead of systems based on competition for limited resources, it would be necessary to develop systems based on cooperation to create abundance through creative application of human talents. Modern technology had already made it technically possible to supply the basic needs of all human beings on the planet. What prevented this weren't technical limitations, but obsolete organizational structures based on competition instead of cooperation. If human resources were organized according to Spinozan principles, each person contributing through their most developed talents, everyone collaborating on projects that promoted collective flourishing, it would be possible to create levels of prosperity and creativity that would transcend anything humanity had ever experienced. The third principle was that healthy social systems promote both individual development and collective cooperation through structures that allow emergence of collective intelligence. This meant that governance should be based not on domination of some over others, but on coordination of complementary contributions to shared objectives. In practice, this required a political revolution. Instead of systems based on competition for power, it would be necessary to develop systems based on coordination of expertise to solve collective problems. Modern digital technology already offered tools that could facilitate sophisticated forms of participatory democracy, where people with relevant knowledge could contribute directly to decisions affecting their areas of expertise. Imagine governments organized more like symphony orchestras, where each participant contributes through their specific competence, where coordination is based on shared understanding of common objectives, where leadership consists of facilitating harmonic expression of all individual contributions. When these three principles were applied systematically, a vision of civilization emerged that was simultaneously profoundly spiritual and rigorously practical. Spiritual because it recognized each person as unique expression of cosmic creativity. Practical because it organized resources and social structures to maximize development and application of human capacities. It was a civilization where work would become creative expression, where politics would become artistic collaboration, where economy would become human ecology, where education would become spiritual discovery, where science would become mystical investigation of nature, where art would become celebration of cosmic creativity. But there was still more. When these principles were applied to specific challenges of the 21st century, climate change, inequality, international conflicts, technological development, solutions emerged that seemed simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. Climate change became opportunity to reorganize energy systems more harmoniously with natural processes, simultaneously creating environmental sustainability and economic prosperity through creative application of clean technologies. Inequality became opportunity to develop systems that would allow each person to discover and apply their unique talents, simultaneously creating individual fulfillment and collective contribution. International conflicts became opportunity to develop forms of cooperation based on complementarity of different cultures and traditions, each contributing with their unique discoveries to general human development. Technological development became opportunity to create tools that would amplify human creative capacities instead of replacing them, allowing more people to participate more fully in the collective development process. Each challenge revealed itself as opportunity to implement Spinozan principles in ways that would simultaneously promote practical solutions and spiritual development. And most extraordinary, when these principles were applied, the solutions that emerged didn't require different groups to sacrifice their legitimate interests. On the contrary, they created situations where everyone could prosper through contributions that expressed their most authentic capacities. It was as if the universe itself had organized in such a way that genuine solutions to collective problems always simultaneously promoted individual flourishing of all participants. This discovery suggested something even deeper about the nature of reality. Perhaps the universe is organized so that cooperation based on authentic expression of individual capacities is not just possible, but inevitable when there's sufficient understanding of the principles involved. Perhaps the true nature of God as the one who becomes through what he causes to become guarantees that creative solutions always emerge when conscious beings cooperate according to their deepest nature. The possibility that the universe is structured so that creative cooperation is inevitable, when there's sufficient understanding of the principles involved, led some researchers to an even deeper investigation of the implications of Spinozan discoveries. If God really is Ehya Asher Ehya, the one who self-causes by becoming through what he causes to become, then every level of reality should express this same principle of creative self-organization. From subatomic particles to galaxies, from individual cells to complex ecosystems, from individual minds to civilizations, everything should function according to the same fundamental principles, and that's exactly what they began to discover. In physics, the discovery that complex systems can spontaneously self-organize when there's sufficient flow of energy and information revealed that the tendency to create order from chaos is a fundamental characteristic of physical reality. In biology, the discovery that living organisms are self-organized systems that maintain and develop themselves through internal processes revealed that life isn't an exception to natural laws, but a particularly sophisticated expression of universal organizational principles. In psychology, the discovery that human consciousness can function as a self-organizing system capable of transcending its own limitations through creative processes revealed that spiritual development isn't supernatural, but is the conscious application of natural principles. In sociology, the discovery that human groups can function as self-organized systems capable of generating collective intelligence that transcends individual capabilities revealed that advanced civilizations aren't artificial impositions on human nature, but sophisticated expressions of that nature. When these discoveries were integrated, universal principles emerged for promoting creative self-organization at any level of reality. First, free flow of information between all system components. Systems self-organize when each part can respond to changes in other parts and in the general environment. Second, diversity of components with complementary capabilities. Self-organization emerges when different elements can contribute in unique ways to the functioning of the whole. Third, structures that allow experimentation and adaptation. Creative systems need to be able to try new configurations and maintain those that work better. Fourth, orientation toward objectives that transcend individual components. Directed self-organization emerges when parts cooperate to realize potentialities of the system as a whole. When these principles were consciously applied to organizing human groups, the results were extraordinary. Experimental communities organized according to Spinozan principles began to demonstrate levels of creativity, prosperity, and personal satisfaction that transcended anything documented in conventional organizations. Companies that applied these principles discovered ways of functioning that were simultaneously more economically efficient and more satisfying for all participants. Schools that implemented education based on Spinozan principles produced students with levels of learning, creativity, and personal development that dramatically exceeded conventional standards. Political communities that experimented with governance based on these principles developed forms of collective decision-making that were simultaneously more democratic and more effective. Each experiment revealed the same pattern. When human systems are organized according to the principles through which the universe itself self-organizes, capacities emerge that dramatically transcend what seemed possible through conventional methods. But there was still more. When sufficient groups began functioning according to these principles, connections and cooperations began to emerge between groups that suggested the possibility of self-organization on a civilizational scale. Groups organized in Spinozan ways discovered they could naturally cooperate with other similar groups in ways that benefited all participants. There was no need for destructive competition or hierarchical domination. Each group could contribute through its unique capacities to projects that promoted the flourishing of the entire network. This suggested that the same principles that allow creative self-organization in small groups could be applied to facilitate creative self-organization on a planetary scale. A global civilization based on Spinozan principles would be a network of self-organized communities, each contributing through its unique capacities and discoveries, all cooperating to create conditions that would allow maximum flourishing of all forms of life on the planet. It would be a civilization where cultural diversity would be celebrated not as obstacle to unity, but as source of creative complementarity, where different traditions would contribute with their unique discoveries about different aspects of human experience, where technological progress would be oriented not toward domination of nature, but toward more harmonious cooperation with natural processes. It would be a civilization that would function more like a living organism than like a mechanical machine, where each part would contribute to the health of the whole, and where the health of the whole would promote the flourishing of each part. And most revolutionary, it would be a civilization where spirituality and rationality, mysticism and science, individual development and collective cooperation wouldn't be competing alternatives, but complementary aspects of the same process of conscious participation in the universe's creative self-organization. People living in this civilization would simultaneously experience profound personal fulfillment through expressing their unique talents and profound sense of purpose through participating in projects that promoted collective good. It would be, finally, the practical implementation of the vision Moses had glimpsed when he understood that God is the one who becomes through what he causes to become. A society where each person could relate directly to the universal creative principle through developing and applying their own creative capacities. A society that would be simultaneously the most sophisticated expression of human nature and humanity's most conscious participation in the cosmic process of self-development. But for this possibility to become reality, it would be necessary for sufficient people to understand, not just intellectually, but experientially, their own nature as expression of universal creativity. Understanding that a planetary civilization based on Spinozan principles wasn't just possible, but could be a natural expression of human evolution, posed a crucial question: how to facilitate sufficient people making the transition from intellectual understanding to direct experience of their own nature as expression of universal creativity. The answer emerged when some researchers realized that Spinoza had developed not just a theoretical philosophy, but a practical technology for this transformation, his theory of effects combined with his practices of intuitive knowledge. Spinoza had discovered that certain specific emotional experiences, which he called joyful affects, are literally experiences of attunement with the universal creative process. When a person feels genuine joy, admiration, love, courage, or generosity, they are directly experiencing their connection with the creative source of all existence. But there was more. Spinoza discovered that these joyful affects aren't just passive consequences of favorable circumstances. They can be actively cultivated through specific practices of attention and understanding. The first practice was what he called knowledge of causes. When a person really understands why something happens, not just superficially, but in the deep connections that link that event to reality's general functioning, they experience a particular form of satisfaction that is literally participation in the understanding the universe itself has of itself. The second practice was what he called knowledge of essences. When a person really understands the deepest nature of something, its function in the whole, its unrealized potentialities, its connections with other aspects of reality, they experience a form of love that is literally participation in the love the universe has for its own manifestations. The third practice was what he called intuitive knowledge. When a person directly understands their own nature as unique expression of universal creativity, they experience a form of beatitude that is literally participation in the satisfaction the universe feels in expressing itself through that specific person. When these three practices were combined and applied systematically, they produced a transformation that Spinoza described as regeneration or rebirth. The person continued being the same unique individuality, but experienced this individuality as conscious expression of cosmic creativity instead of as separate entity struggling for survival in a hostile world. This transformation wasn't just psychological. It was simultaneously intellectual, emotional, ethical, and even physical. People who went through this transformation reported not just greater satisfaction and creativity, but also greater health, greater capacity for cooperation, greater efficiency in their activities, and greater capacity to contribute to collective good. And most important, they spontaneously discovered ways of living that expressed Spinozan principles of creative self-organization. Not because someone had taught them these principles, but because this was the natural way of living when one directly experiences their own nature as expression of universal creativity. This suggested that civilizational transformation based on Spinozan principles didn't require convincing masses of people to adopt a new ideology. It required only facilitating sufficient people having access to practices that allowed direct experience of their own spiritual nature. When this happened, these people naturally began to organize their lives in ways that promoted both their own flourishing and the flourishing of others. And when sufficient people lived this way, social structures based on creative cooperation instead of destructive competition began to emerge spontaneously. In the 21st century, several discoveries made these Spinozan practices more accessible and effective than ever before in history. Neuroscience revealed that conscious attention practices produce measurable changes in brain structure and functioning, developing capacities for experiences Spinoza had described as intuitive knowledge. Positive psychology identified emotional states that correspond precisely to Spinozan joyful affects and developed methods to cultivate them systematically. Quantum physics offered conceptual languages that made it easier to intellectually understand Spinozan concepts about the fundamental interconnection of all reality. Digital technologies created possibilities for sharing practices and discoveries on a global scale, allowing people anywhere in the world to have access to the most effective practices for spiritual development. When these discoveries were integrated into a systematic program based on Spinozan principles, personal development methods emerged that were simultaneously profoundly spiritual and rigorously scientific, methods that allowed any person, regardless of cultural or religious background, to have direct access to experiences Spinoza had described as the highest possible realizations for human beings. And when sufficient people began having these experiences, communities, projects, and movements organized according to Spinozan principles began to emerge spontaneously, not as a result of ideological planning, but as natural expression of people who had experientially discovered their own nature as manifestation of universal creativity. These communities began to demonstrate in practice that it was possible to organize human life in ways that simultaneously promoted material prosperity, personal fulfillment, social cooperation, and spiritual development. And when these demonstrations became sufficiently visible and attractive, they began to inspire similar experimentations on an increasingly larger scale. It began to seem possible that humanity was on the threshold of a transformation Spinoza had anticipated 300 years before. The emergence of a civilization based on understanding that each person is a unique expression of the creativity that organizes the entire cosmos. A civilization that would be simultaneously the most sophisticated implementation of modern scientific discoveries about self-organization and cooperation, and the most complete realization of ancient spiritual intuitions about the divine nature of human beings. A civilization that would finally answer the question that had tormented humanity for millennia. how to live in ways that are simultaneously rational and spiritual, individual and collective, practical and transcendent. The answer was proving surprisingly simple. Live according to your deepest nature, as expression of the creativity that self-organizes through all forms of existence. 350 years after Baruch Spinoza's death, his deepest discoveries were finally being understood and implemented. The true name that God had revealed to Moses, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the one who self-causes by becoming through what he causes to become, was finally being recognized as the key to understanding not only divine nature, but the very nature of reality and the highest potential of human civilization. The journey had been long. Centuries of dogmatic distortions had obscured the original vision. Generations of thinkers had struggled to reconcile reason and spirituality without understanding that both are aspects of the same fundamental reality. Billions of people had lived and died without knowing their true nature as expression of cosmic creativity. But now in the 21st century, all the pieces were finally falling into place. Modern science had rediscovered what the original biblical texts had always taught, that reality is a self-organizing system where consciousness and matter are inseparable aspects of the same fundamental creative process. Modern psychology had rediscovered what Spinoza had always known, that human beings prosper when they understand and express their nature as manifestation of universal creativity. Modern sociology had rediscovered what Moses had tried to implement, that human societies function best when organized according to principles that promote the flourishing of all participants through expression of their unique capacities. And for the first time in history, humanity had both the knowledge and technological tools necessary to implement these discoveries on a planetary scale. The vision of a civilization based on Spinozan principles was no longer philosophical utopia. It was practical possibility that was beginning to manifest through thousands of local experiments, demonstrating its viability. Communities organized according to these principles were producing levels of prosperity, creativity, and satisfaction that dramatically exceeded conventional standards. Individuals who had experientially discovered their nature as expression of universal creativity were living lives of meaning and contribution that inspired others to seek similar developments. Technologies developed according to Spinozan principles were creating solutions to global problems that seemed simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. And all this was happening not through violent revolution or authoritarian imposition, but through spontaneous emergence of more sophisticated forms of human organization based on deeper understanding of human nature. It was as if the universe itself was organizing to facilitate this transformation. As if cosmic evolution had reached the point where human consciousness was ready to consciously participate in the process through which reality self-develops. Spinoza's discovery about God's true name had revealed not just a theological truth, but the organizational principle through which the entire cosmos functions. And now humanity was learning to consciously live according to this principle. The result would be a civilization that would express the best of all human traditions, the rationality of science, the wisdom of spiritual traditions, the creativity of arts, the cooperation of genuine democracy, the efficiency of advanced technology. A civilization where each person could discover and express their unique talents through contributions to projects that promoted collective flourishing. A civilization where diversity would be source of creative complementarity, not destructive conflict. A civilization where progress would be measured not just by technological capabilities, but by quality of life, personal fulfillment, social cooperation, and spiritual development. A civilization that would be simultaneously deeply natural, expressed from the deepest nature of human beings, and transcendentally inspiring, conscious participation in the creativity that organizes the entire universe. This civilization was emerging, not through central planning or imposed ideology, but through spontaneous discovery by people across the planet that living according to their deepest nature naturally produces forms of social organization based on creative cooperation. God's true name, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, was finally being understood not as object of religious belief, but as precise description of reality's nature and invitation for conscious participation in the cosmic process of self-development. The 3,000-year lie was being corrected. Humanity was discovering its true nature, and the result would be a civilizational transformation that would finally realize the highest potential of the human species. Baruch Spinoza had planted the seeds. 3 centuries later, they were finally germinating in a flowering that would transform the world. The journey to discover what God really said was complete, and the journey to live according to this discovery was just beginning. God's true name wasn't, "I am that I am." It was, "I become through what I cause to become." And now, finally, humanity was learning to live as conscious participant in this divine process of continuous creation. The greatest discovery in history had been made. The greatest transformation in history was beginning. And it had all started with a solitary man in 1670 who had the courage to read an ancient text and ask, "What do these words really mean?" This was the story of how Baruch Spinoza discovered that "I am that I am" is a lie, and revealed the name that God really said. A discovery that remained buried for 350 years, but can now transform our understanding of spirituality, science, society, and the very purpose of human existence. If this journey touched something deep in you, if it awakened questions that go beyond conventional answers, then you are part of this transformation that is emerging in the world. You are one of the people the universe is using to become conscious of its own creative nature. Spinoza's discovery wasn't just historical, it was prophetic, and now we are living the times he foresaw, when humanity would finally be ready to live according to its true spiritual nature. God's true name has been revealed, history's greatest lie has been exposed, and a new era of understanding is being born.